I'll just do a quick introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Kurt Gutyar, Managing Director at the Center of the American West. And this is our fourth in our series, Bipartisanship and Friendship Happens, featuring Scott McInnis and David Skaggs. We're super excited for today's event. We don't have any future of these events scheduled quite yet, but they will reappear in the fall and perhaps in person. We shall see. However, we do have one other event that is coming up on June 9th. It is part of our Historians Imagine series, where we celebrate the role of creativity in the craft of history. That will feature Natalia Molina. It's at 12 noon on June 9th. And then for everybody's information, we are recording this session, so it will be up on our website in about a week. So if you know people who would like to listen in and were not able to register today, that would be one great way. And it's also being streamed on Facebook. So hi, our Facebook audience. Patty has a set of prepared questions, but we do respond to some of the Q&A sometimes too. So don't be shy about using that. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Patty and Scott and David.
Well, thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Center team, for putting this together, and thank you especially Congress people, Scott McInnis and David Skaggs. This is a series that has meant a lot to me, and I think to many others who've had a chance to take part in it, because as you might have had occasion to notice, congeniality between people who have different party affiliations is not entirely at its peak right now. So the notion of seeing people who are really not peas in a pod politically or ideologically or anything like that, but who have really found much reason to take, I'm going to say, joy in each other's company. That is really a wonderful, wonderful situation to be in. So with the understanding that it is better for the audience to just get to hearing our guests as fast as possible, I will not do introductions, but the two friends will introduce each other. And I'll just say, just for our moment of orientation, that Scott McInnis served in Congress from 1993 to 2004, and David Skaggs served from 1987 to 1999. I guess I should have said 2005 for that. So they overlapped for a good 6 years in Congress. And we'll get to this. I think both of them will want to speak on this subject. They served in the Colorado State Legislature before they went to Congress, and that was really the foundation of, well, let's just say that if more people elected to Congress had served with each other in state legislators, we might be in a better state. So who wants to go first in introducing the other person?
Well, I'm senior, I think, right?
You are, that's right. You are a senior. So yes, I think Congressman Skaggs should certainly start.
Oh, well, what the heck. Well, anyway, glad to be here. Thanks for doing this, Patty. Good to see Scott and have a chance to ruminate a little bit about what we went through together. I would start out by just saying that Scott is a true conservative and a reputable conservative, especially given what conservative has come to mean these days sometimes. He is a child of the West, born in Glenwood, I think, and represented the 3rd Congressional District in the years that you mentioned, Patty. And for those that may not be familiar with the geography of Colorado, the 3rd District is vast. It's basically all of the West, especially when Scott represented it, all of Colorado west of the Continental Divide, and then looping around to capture Pueblo and some of south central Colorado as well. But anyway, he was a very authentic representative of the West. As you said, time in Congress, time in the legislature, which is where we got to know each other, and where his colleagues elected him to be the majority leader in the Colorado House. I never knew what it was like to be in the majority in the Colorado House. And so I was merely the minority leader when Scott was running the show. But we dealt with each other, I think, respectfully, and have tried to do that ever since. He is, I think, a proverbial straight shooter, a very dedicated public servant. He's still in public service as a commissioner in Mesa County. And happily, I think it's right to say, accurate to say, that we shared some common purposes and common cause, especially in dealing with issues important to Colorado, and especially among those, preserving, the natural treasures of our state. So we work together on things like the great, well, Scott gets most of the credit for the Great Sand Dunes National Park, along with Ben Campbell, and preserving the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and has a national conservation area named for him, the Canyons National Conservation Area west of Grand Junction. So it's a treat to be here with Scott. Over to you, Scott.
Well, thank you very much, David. And David Skaggs has a resume that runs very deep, and I won't go into a lot of depth, but I will tell you that when I first met David, someone pulled me aside and they said, "You do know his background, don't you?" And I said, "Well, he's a Democrat from Boulder, but I love Boulder, and he seems like a real nice gentleman. My family has a lot of history in Boulder." And I said, "But he seems like a really nice gentleman." And they said, "Well, he has a very distinguished military career. In fact, he's retired. He was a major in the U.S. Marine Corps and served in Vietnam." And for me, that was like a wow. That's 2 or 3 steps above my level, and that was a good way to start a relationship because I had a lot of respect. I have an older brother that's your age, David, and went through those trying days, and so that's kind of an automatic button of acceptance for me. But David covered, I think, a lot of the relationship that we've been really kind of blessed to have between each other. But David served in the House. He was a majority leader. He's a lawyer, practiced law. And I think that not only his service in the State House of Representatives, which was distinguished, but also his service in the United States Congress, and understandably his dedication to the environment, his dedication to the state of Colorado and so on, ended up with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administrative David Skaggs Research Center in Boulder, which is a massive facility, was named in his honor, and that's well deserved. And that kind of speaks highly of not just David, but of his record of service to the people in the state. Especially impressive that people probably don't know is David's very, very focused on ethics and bipartisanship in the United States Congress. And after Congress, Congressman Skaggs was one of those few people that continued to worry about the direction that the United States was going. The United States Congress was going, and as far as ethics was concerned, as far as bipartisanship, and frankly, as far as behavior amongst our colleagues. David was an adjunct professor over at Colorado University, but he went on to become the executive director for democracy and citizenship. He also headed our State Department, if I remember correctly, David, the Colorado State Department of Education. I think
Higher ed.
Higher ed, yes, higher ed for, thank you for correction, for Governor Ritter. And then he was the first chairman of the board of the Office of Congressional Ethics, which I think is a very critical thing, especially, Patty, as you've said, in the atmosphere that we have today. I also found interesting in his background with his service in the military that he was the co-chairman of what they call the War Powers Committee. And I'd be fascinated to hear some of those discussions. I think that would be an interesting subject. But I say this honestly, and I've said it many a time without David in the presence. When I think of standouts and my close friends on the other side, there are 3 or 4 that come right to mind. One of them is Governor Lamb. One of them is my friend David Skaggs, my friend Ben Campbell. I mean, those 3, and an awful lot of respect for your colleague, Congressman Skaggs. I keep so used to Congresswoman, Congressman, but Representative Ruth Wright, who we also served with. And I always thought she was a fine, sharp individual. And Boulder was well represented in that area with Representative Skaggs and Representative Wright, and then later on Congressman Skaggs. So, I mean, we could talk forever about his background. Mine's very short. Yours is honorable, and you've got to be awful proud of the service you've given to our nation and to our state. Thank you.
Those are very
Thank you.
excellent introductions. I am going to point out one thing that you have, Scott, that Mr. Skaggs has made up for, but doesn't have, which is, good heavens, the poor man was born in Cincinnati, I think, and then lived in the New Jersey suburbs of New York City. So, and now he is total Coloradan and all in, and has been that for many years, all in for Colorado. But he does have, compared to you, if we are going by the good luck of where we happen to be when our mothers gave birth to us, if we go by that, he's got Cincinnati and New Jersey, good heavens. So could you talk just a little bit, both of you, about your origins and how your childhood, this came up with Fred Upton and Diana to get to, just how does your origins and your childhood, how does that shape what you became as public servants?
You want to go first this time, Scott?
Well, I'm happy to. I mean, our family, on both sides of our family, and including my wife's family, ironically, almost identical. My wife's family homesteaded a cattle ranch, which is a large operation near Meeker, Colorado, which they still operate in the family today, 140 some years. Her family came in the 1880s. My mother's family came to Colorado, southern Colorado, in the 1870s. My father's family in the 1860s. And my father's family were in cattle ranching and banking. And ironically, and what a privilege to be again in the presence of Congressman Skaggs, but the ranch was called the Kohler Ranch, kind of like the plumbing fixtures, Kohler. And the Kohler Ranch was headquarters of the ranch is where the CU campus is, where the towers and so on, that area. Huh. And in fact, Basin Road, or the big boulevard there, used to be named Kohler Road before it became the, where in fact, I think we're meeting just off that later on this evening. On my mother's side, and also the other thing is the bank, which is a historical building down there in the mall. That was the family bank. And then on my mother's side, down in Walsenburg, Colorado, Levita, Colorado, Cachera, down in that country, multiple generations, and they were shoe cobblers and bankers and ranching. And my great aunt, either great aunt or great aunt's name was Wilhelmina Jacopina Gould. And if you were to look it up in Google, she and her husband, Jeremiah Gould, were cattle ranchers and decided they wanted to have a small community and that this is a wonderful state and that part of the state need to have a community. So they drew up a map and donated the land and even named all the streets. And the town was called Castle Rock, Colorado. So we have a lot of roots. But at any rate, long story short, the family is on both sides are large families. I think almost everyone in the family still resides in Colorado. And to the person in our family, everybody's felt a responsibility to one, our neighbors, and to our state and to our country. So like all of you, we have a deep sense of patriotism on both the local and the federal level of the country. So we're deeply into what we've got. I'm very proud of the opportunity to serve the population.
That's amazing, Scott. I had no idea that on both sides of your family, you went back to the 19th century. I wish I had that many cousins in the state when I was running for office, but anyway. The reason I was born in Cincinnati, Patty, is that my family is all from Kentucky originally, and the hospital at that point was across the Ohio River in Cincinnati. So I really claim to be a Kentuckian at birth, and still have lots of family in Kentucky, and can talk Kentucky if I need to sometimes. But my dad was in the graphic arts and book design and typography and calligraphy, and so the place where that craft and art was centered was New York City. So we moved up to New York City when I was very little, and then out to suburban New Jersey, where I grew up, and where my home of record was until I moved to Colorado after I got out of the Marine Corps. I am the black sheep in that both of my parents and both sides of the family were arch Republicans. And so, I went away to college and got infected and turned into a Democrat, and the rest is history. But more pertinent to your question, politics and what was going on in the country and in the world were regular dinner table conversations when I was growing up. I found all of that pretty fascinating. I had no idea I could ever get elected to anything after I lost my student council election in high school. But when I got to Colorado, it was very welcoming of newcomers. That was the era where there were a lot of native bumper stickers on cars, letting people know that the driver had been lucky enough to start out in Colorado. I was not, but that was 1971. And I figure now, if 50 years, I'm in good shape, right?
Wow.
And the Colorado or the Boulder County Democratic Party was very welcoming of fresh blood at that point in the early 70s. Boulder was a Republican stronghold. So it was not exactly the easiest course to take, but I believed in most of what the Democratic Party stood for then and still do. So worked my way through and ended up, as you know, running for the Colorado House in 1980. And one thing led to another. So that's the painfully long story about how I got involved in things.
No, and I'm going to just hold back and not ask you to do a very brief performance of Talking Kentucky, of speaking as if you were from Kentucky. I'm not going to ask for that. I'm very tempted to know what you would sound like, because it seems like it would be so different from your usual.
Well, if you're from Kentucky, you call it Louisville.
Well, of course. What? If you say it, or you would say Louisville, don't you? What? Pardon me.
Oh, look, if you're from Grayson County, it's Louisville.
I had no idea. Learning all the time as the faculty director of the
Oh, and I left out a very important fact, which is that my maternal grandfather, McKinley Allen, was a Republican office holder in Grayson County, Kentucky.
Is that right? Uh-huh.
My first experience in hands-on politics was going out with, we called him Papa Allen, campaigning out, driving dusty gravel roads in Grayson County, Kentucky in the summertime, handing out emery boards and rulers and one thing and another with McKinley Allen for county clerk. Very, very retail politics, but it sticks with you.
That's really interesting.
I might add, Patricia, it's so interesting, David. I didn't know that about the family. So my grandfather in Southern Colorado ran the Democratic machine in Southern Colorado. And then his brother, actually, I think ran for Secretary of the State as a Democrat. And when I first got elected to the House of Representatives, an elderly gentleman, probably my age now, came up and said, "I'd like to buy you lunch as a thank you." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure we met." He introduced himself and he said, "Well," he said, "50 years ago, your grandfather was the most powerful Democrat, and the Democrats ruled down there and in that part of the state." And he said, he got, because of the patronage that was utilized back then, he got me a job with the city and county of Denver. And he said, "I'm retiring this year. Your grandfather's gone." He said, "But I wanted to just say thank you to your grandfather through you." And the gentleman bought me lunch at the Brown Palace.
Wow.
And so interesting, isn't it?
Well, it is interesting because now we know that you're both kind of mixed ancestry, that your political affiliation is, I thought I have seen studies that political affiliation is very linear and direct through generations, but I see that we're complicating that. And I do know that Bruce Babbitt, his uncles and father and grandfather were very, very Republican, and that he actually occasionally would be condemned in an editorial by one of his uncles when he was governor. That was even more intense. But how interesting, these mixed ancestry. So I think we want to go straight now to the origins of the friendship. So, and we've got some of that going already with the legislature, but I'm going to say that state legislators are not always on their way to lasting friendships. At least that's the way it looks from the outside, that is not necessarily the place where warm and lasting ties are born. So could you tell us about the origins of your friendship and they're really so interestingly place-based when we think about the divides in Colorado today of Western Slope and Front Range. So that's should be somewhere in your narratives here as well. So whichever, I just throw it. I guess we had Scott start last time. I can't remember. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'd already been at the state legislature for a couple of years when Scott was elected. And you know, it was such a different environment in those days. I think the state legislature, even today, is a more congenial environment than the national politics. But anyway, certainly in the 80s, when we got to know each other, we spent a lot of time together, whether it's during debate on the floor or if you have overlapping committee assignments. What were your committees, Scott? I forget. Anyway,
Yes.
you know, and there's the tussle and some contention and debate over bills, and I suspect I was a pain in the neck to Scott sometimes when I was opposing bills that were being rammed through by that huge Republican majority. But we developed respect for each other's views, and one of the things that's missing in our politics today, especially in the U.S. House, is having colleagues spend enough time together to get to know each other well enough to develop some sense of trust so that you can work out your differences. So anyway, that's, in my mind, the origin of how we got to know each other and how we got to get along.
And well, it's very interesting. Again, a big green light with David. I'm so used out of respect saying Congressman Skaggs, but really was his military service. I mean, to me, that said a lot. I never served in the military. I actually went to a military school, but that was more on a basis of misbehavior than it was planning a career in the military.
Could we get the details on that, Scott?
Well, you know, today it would be like, I'm not even sure they'd give you discipline today for it, but back then, you know, riding horses into stores and things like that. So, but at any rate,
Now, isn't that
so, you know, I'll tell you something else. So, you know, you know, first sight, and don't judge a book by its cover, but you do start out by looking at the cover of the book. And I'll give you a brief description of my impression of Representative Skaggs. Number one, he was always professional. At the very beginning, he was well dressed. Now, that may seem like kind of a minor deal, but, you know, he fit the part. He fit the part of a gentleman, and I'm not taking anything away from a gentle lady, et cetera, but and he fit the part of a statesman, this image I had, and then his military background. And one of the first things I did when I went to the State House was they hand out a biography of all of your colleagues. And if you'll remember, David, the Denver Post used to run like 2 or 3 times a week, a biography of each representative. And I would clip those and study the background of every one of my colleagues. And one of the first I happened to end up with was, ironically, David Skaggs. And these were not hit pieces. These were complimentary pieces, but it just built on my first impression. And I can tell you, I did work with David an awful lot. While we certainly voted differently on a number of different issues, and a lot of that was but was as a result of the kind of fiduciary duty we had to our district. I had a rural district. Representative Skaggs had an urban district, although he has rural areas. And as you know, he's a farmer now. Lives on a farm. You can tell he's been successful on the farm by the nice chair he sits in, and he's done well. But so we would have differences of opinion on issues, but never once did I recall one that he wasn't always a gentleman. That on the floor, you'll remember Ron Straley, David, our friend, our colleague, who was the majority leader when I went in, and he was very, very strict about protocol. And, you know, the requirements and the etiquette, so to speak, when you were on the House floor, or your behavior in the House chambers or in the Capitol itself. And I always looked up to David because he always fit the T on that. And obviously, I mean, he was a lawyer, so we had that in common. I don't know. I just started at the very beginning with a deep appreciation, and as the years went on, all that was ratified. Everything I thought in the beginning turned out. So again, our voting records, although when you look back at them, were closer together than most people would think, but it turned out that was a book that I judged by its cover, and I was absolutely right. The cover was representative of the content of the book. I will say one other thing that was I remember distinctly, January 28th, 1986. And David, you probably don't recall this. You'll recall the day when I mentioned why it's important history. But I had just heard, and I think, David, you may have been even preparing to run for Congress at that point. But at any rate, I had just heard that we had suffered a national tragedy with the Challenger. And I ran into David just as he was coming out of a committee. And I told David, again, in representative, out of respect, representative, but if you don't mind, David, for those of you listening, and I said to David, David, have you heard what's happened? And he said to me, what's happened? And I said, the Challenger just exploded. And I'll never forget, it's like it was yesterday. It's like I'm looking at him right now, and that the expression on his face reminded me of the image I had of a general in the military finding out they've just had a massive loss to the troops. That sincerity in his face, that moment, if I could have captured that, where they would say, where I live, that guy's the real McCoy. I mean, it was just an instant of care, of concern, and of leadership. And I remember that moment very, very well. That morning, you were walking out of committee in the basement of the state capitol when I told you that, and I just heard it. So we both had just heard it. Just an interesting little point of how that puts a perspective on a person, on what they think of another person for years into the future.
Well, thanks for the story, Scott. I had forgotten that incident, but it's very meaningful. Yeah.
So, okay. So the legislature and running into each other a lot and having some very meaningful encounters and voting opposite, but sometimes, but not all the time. Then encountering each other in Congress, in the United States Congress, which seems like quite a change of ambiance and environment and forms of conduct and protocol. So I wonder if you could, but I know I'm trying not to be too much referring to Congress today. So if you could talk about what Congress was like, and I know you both entered at rather different times. So 1987 is not 1993, but did you enter the company of a group of people who seemed to be trying to get along, who seemed to have the kinds of friendships that you would end up, that you brought from Colorado? I mean, what was that point of entry? And did it seem to be a place where you were supposed to just visit with and ally yourself with your fellow party members? Or what was the ambiance there that you came into, and how did your friendship adapt to that ambiance?
Well, I'll go ahead and start that one. For me, it was a real shock. First of all, you're going from 100 in the legislative process in Colorado to, I think at the time we served was 535 in the U.S. House of Representatives. You've got 26,000 people. At that time, there were 26,000 people that worked on the Hill. I mean, so it was like going from small town to big city. And you all of a sudden had travel requirements you never had, even came close to at the state legislative process. And I know David has referred to this in many of his writings, the not living in Washington, the travel requirements. And there's a big difference in the legislative process, in that in the legislative process on the House and the Senate side, although in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate, they have assigned seats. But in the State House, you have assigned seats. And in the State House, you have electronic voting. and the machine opens for about 2 minutes. So at the State House, you were on the floor an awful lot, and you got to know the people to your right, to your left, and in front of you, and you had plenty of time to stand around and talk. And again, there were only 100 of you. So you really develop personalities. The kind of friendships that I developed at the state capitol, I did not develop at the U.S. Capitol. In fact, I was a year or two into my service as a U.S. congressman, and I would find myself at a banquet or something where we were being introduced, and the person sitting next to me was a congressperson, and I didn't even know they were in the U.S. Congress. That's how big an operation. So what you kind of do is you fell back, and it actually, you kind of start with the people you knew. And when I went to the U.S. Congress, the only people I knew were my fellow members of the delegation. And with David, he was always welcome, and his staff immediately reached out the first day we got there to help us with constituent service, because that was a clock that was always running. And but it was, for me anyway, it was a much colder atmosphere. I enjoyed it. Don't take me wrong. I considered it a privilege. But for me, I really had to adjust. And I felt I felt appreciative that, my colleagues there, Ben Campbell, Congressman Skaggs, et cetera, really, your first couple of weeks there, you depend very heavily on the rest of the delegation to open their arms, welcome you, and kind of show you the ropes. And I was lucky. Everyone in the delegation did that, with one exception. But so that was kind of my reaction when I first got to Congress.
I'm inclined to answer your question, Patty, by really thinking about how different the place was when Scott and I were there, and how much better. So, the impression that you get from watching the news coverage of the place is that, it's always low-level warfare that occasionally bursts into major confrontations. And, whereas in fact, most days, most of the time, you're working on stuff together with somebody from the other party. And most of the bills that go through the House, even today, are voted on by large bipartisan majorities. You just never hear about those. You hear about the fights. And we can talk more about that and the unfortunate influence that the media has in encouraging that behavior. But anyway, the time I was in the House was a time in which both parties looked for ways to work together to solve problems. And yes, there were bills on which there were sharp partisan divisions, but they were not the day-to-day story of the place. My time in the House was largely defined by committee work, which is, as I suspect was true for Scott as well, where you spend hours and hours with people on the same committee and subcommittee, and you really get to know them pretty well, in much the same way that we did when we were in the Colorado legislature. But there just wasn't the same level of sort of gratuitous viciousness that occasionally springs up these days. Some of my best friends were Republicans from my class. That's the other thing, the class with whom you are elected. So the other people that were elected in 1986 when I was, including John Lewis, the icon of the civil rights movement, but John was another classmate. And Ben Campbell and Joel Heffley, Republicans from, Ben was then a Democrat. Amo Houghton, just a wonderful upstate New York Republican who was a dear, dear friend. So anyway, it was just and that behavior, that attitude toward colleagues was encouraged and welcomed and supported in those days. So a shame that it is now in such short supply.
I have, to the to my peril, I shall now say that I read the New York Times all the time, and I often feel very good about reading the New York Times, but I do have my moments of thinking, I seem to keep reading the same story over and over again about partisan divisiveness, and I think, why do I keep reading the story since it's the same story? Yesterday, there was an article in the New York Times that I think had a very error-filled portrayal of the National Park Service's recognition of climate change. I know because I watch those things happen in real time. And the New York Times had an error-enriched piece yesterday. So because that happened yesterday, I think I'm going to press a question that I didn't put into the questions, but why does that happen? Why do errors occur, and why are they not corrected? And is it just the if it bleeds, it leads thing? Why would there be such a enthusiasm for writing stories about fights in Congress and so little comparative enthusiasm for writing stories about people working together? Is there a literary problem here? I mean, why is that the case? But I'm having a little bit of a crisis of trust in the New York Times today after yesterday's story. So,
Well, maybe
take it when you'd like. Yes, go.
maybe you can do one of these webinar things with journalists and sort of probe on that question a little bit more. Scott will quickly remember what we call what is still called the Speaker's Lobby, just off the floor of the House, where reporters were permitted to lay in wait for members of Congress of the House to come out so that they could grab you and ask you a question. And especially in the last couple of years I was there, I sort of tried to turn the tables on them to the point that you were just making, Patty, not that there are errors, but how do they feel about the state of journalism now, rather than, sort of the old New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, where, you got into the meat of issues and why this side believes that and the other side believes something else. And it was really educative of the reading public rather than just covering the horse races and the fights. And journalists then, whether print or electronic, would roll their eyes when I would ask them about that and say, it's the business side of the paper, or it's the business side of the TV station, that they can't continue to publish if they don't sell papers or sell ads and have eyeballs that are largely attracted to the kind of coverage that's become more prevalent. Sad to say.
Yeah, Scott, do you want to?
Well, I think that my opinion is that the journalistic field has lost complete control of the kind of coverage and the kind of responsibilities that the media exercised when Representative Skaggs, David, and I served. I think we were real lucky, and I'm a strong believer in journalism. I think it brings a lot of checks and balances. But today with social media, and frankly, on social media, you have got to have something instantly, and you post it instantly. And I think the accuracy of what's been reported has gotten a torpedo on its side. You just throw something out there. On top of that, it kind of the Huey Long days, when Huey Long was losing his race, was quite a character of his own, but this has been attributed to him. I'm not sure that's accurate, but it has been attributed to him. And in his days, he was losing this race. His campaign manager told him that we're going to lose the race. I don't know what to do. And Huey Long said, well, get it out there that my opponent is abusing his wife. And his campaign manager told Huey Long, that's not true. And Huey Long's response was, let him deny it. And today, you just see that this fake news. Now, the Trump thing's a whole different deal. But generally speaking, both parties have adopted this policy. And with social media, it spreads. As Will Rogers said, a lie gets around the world before the truth has the opportunity to put its shoes on in the morning. And it's the same thing here. Let them deny it. You don't have, I think you still have your Wall Street Journal, your New York Times. I think the Denver Gazette, their news section of it, the Post, all of those, they still have certain burdens or standards they expect from the reporters. But they've lost control, not within their own operation, but they've been overwhelmed by social media now, and people that are kind of self-proclaimed reporters have never had journalistic ethics required courses or things like that. And I think fake news has become ordinary news in today's society, and it's a big frustration for me, and it impacts everybody across the board. I'm not being partisan here. It's just across the board. Now, I don't know what the answer is, but that's what I see today as a huge difference between when David and I started our careers in public service.
You know, I'm sort of inclined myself to blame the consumers as much as the producers, or maybe more.
Yes.
That and the consumers who then push it out on social media, because I think, and maybe it's a literary problem, that it is not easy to write a front page above the fold story about a congenial encounter between two legislators who sat down and solved the problem together. That is a literary challenge, to say, these two people, they worked well together. That seems it seems like it is something of, and also because the consumers are going to say, well, that's a pretty boring story, I guess, and move on. So I would like to just bring the consumers in for a round of accountability for some.
Well, can I jump in on that, Patty? So the consumer, that is the citizen, that is the electorate,
Yeah.
and to give them both the appropriate quantum of responsibility, but also a little bit of a break. For the last, I don't know, 40 years or so, we have underinvested in what I will still call civic education or social studies or history or government or economics, or anyway, the kinds of instruction in especially the high schools that bring about a consuming public that is interested in news that covers substance, not just personality. And a bunch of us have been working for a long time to try to reverse course on that. I think it has a lot to do with why the population is so easily affected by the social media that Scott was talking about, why we are prone to sort of the easy way out of staying on top of public affairs and only being amused by the fights. So it's the old Pogo cartoon that was first published, I think, on Earth Day, the first Earth Day, where I forget which character is saying what, but basically they're looking around in a swamp with junk that's piled up in tires and tin cans and so forth. And the caption is, "We met the enemy and it is us." So, we need a population that is more insistent on real news rather than fake news.
Right. So I'm wondering, well, okay, so I think we've covered a number of the questions here, but I just want to come back to the delegation and the community of the people from the same state. And is that holding steady through all these changes? Is it still that sense of the folks from, well, I'm not going to say California, but the folks from, or is there something that's particularly valuable about Colorado and its issues and qualities and culture and temperament that made that Colorado delegation a real sense of, we're going to work together? Or does that just run continuously through Congress through different areas that the delegation members from a particular state are going to think, better work with that guy?
Wow.
I don't know.
Well, my only recent data points on that, Patty, are back when I was still traveling to Washington a couple of times a month for one reason and another, and would often be on the flight home on a Friday afternoon, and most of the Colorado delegation were down on the same plane. And so I would hear the banter between those people and the goodwill and the humor and the kidding and things that are sort of let you know that there is a sense of congeniality and community there. I don't know how much of that persists in their work once they're in the Capitol. I hope a lot.
Right. Well, right. And I guess I'm such a fan of the notion of place-based loyalties, even though I do understand that you can have very different loyalties to the state of Colorado, and the rural and urban split being one big one, which we'll get back to, I guess. But could you just say a word or two about your favorite stories of observing, participating in the creation of coalitions or the work of an alliance where no one could have a situation where everyone was satisfied, but people could say, well, here's a compromise I can make, and so on. So do you have one or two stories of just seeing that happen in Congress where people could have dug in and nothing would have changed or improved or been dealt with, but people said, well, okay, I think I can build an alliance here. I can build a coalition. Do you have a couple of stories of that sort that you might want to hear?
You know, I can tell you that when I first went back to Congress, and we had a congressman, I think he's still alive today, out of California, called B1 Bob Dornan, remember? And he was very extreme. And then we had somebody very similar on the Democratic side. And I used to think to myself, what a waste. You know, they are so extreme, and they're smart people, they're good people, but their time could be put to much better use. But I began to think about that, and I thought, wow, they are being put to use. They serve a very important role, these extremes. And the reason it did is I remember, in fact, when, of course, I've thought a lot about David lately in preparation for this, but I remember that David, the relationship I had with David, for example, is David and I could talk. You could go to David and say, David, look, we can't follow, and I won't mention the name, but man, you got a crazy person over there. And likewise, David would say, well, what about B1 Bob? And what it did is it drove people that weren't that extreme to say, look, we're going to have to work together, or one of the two of these is going to get their way. And I think very much they face that today with Cortez or some of the other people in the House on both sides of that. So that I felt that was useful. And I also felt I had a similar feeling about redistricting and safe districts. And I thought, my original thought was no district should be a safe district. It should always be 50-50. You know, the best way to get McDonald's to improve its hamburgers, build a Burger King across the street. But then I began to realize, you know, you've got to have some districts that people can make some tough votes out of. And because there are some tough votes in Congress, beside all the rhetoric and maybe the popular opinions against you, but this nation has to run. You've got to run day-to-day business. And fortunately, you had people that would take maybe unpopular votes, but they were in a safe district, so they didn't have to have that political element end up there. So I ended up thinking, well, there is a place for extremes. There's a place for safe districts, because in fact, most of the day-to-day operations are very dependent on people such as Congressman Skaggs and myself being able to cross that line and sitting back in the cloakroom and say, hey, how do we guide this? Where are we going to be able to do that? And I felt that occurred a lot more often than was represented.
Well, and Scott, you've frozen, I'm afraid. Are you all there?
We'll just hope for the best, because it can happen to any of us these days.
Well, you know, a couple of stories you suggest, Patty. One was when I first got to the House in '87, Tim Wirth, who preceded me and was then new in the Senate, had done an awful lot of the groundwork for what became the Colorado Wilderness Act of eventually 1993. But I went to work on that and picked up as best I could where Tim had left off, and not fast forwarding because it was a real slog, working through all of the competing interests that had to be respected and dealt with in crafting wilderness legislation, water rights issues, recreational access issues, motorized vehicle issues, basic conservation issues. And for the end of that, Hank Brown, then Republican senator from Colorado, was the point person on the Senate side dealing with the constituencies in Colorado that were critical to fashioning a compromise that could pass. And I was trying to do that on the House side. And, it really got down to boundary line issues and how you deal with the rights through the Moffat Tunnel and, all kinds of details. And it was a give and take, and we got to a happy ending. So with President Clinton coming out to sign the bill out at the old Denver airport. The other quick story, I also went on the Public Works and Transportation Committee when I was first elected because I had it in my mind that we needed somebody on that committee to work on aviation issues because we were just getting going and building the new airport. And so there were some critical issues that had to be resolved there. And I went on the aviation subcommittee. The ranking Republican then, when the Democrats were in the majority, was Newt Gingrich. And Newt already had a reputation, if you will, as a firebrand Republican. But on the committee, he was as easy to work with as could be. And we were able to resolve some issues and get some provisions into legislation so that the FAA could do what it needed to do to go ahead with construction of the new airport.
But we seem to have a flurry of people falling off our screen here. So we've lost Patty.
To the rescue.
So welcome everybody. I do have another interesting question that I've been saving because you guys have been dancing around this. And we'll start with you, and hopefully we'll get Scott back and Patty back. How do members of Congress, actually that's not it, how has your service in Congress deepened your understanding of human nature?
Well, sort of extrapolating from the point that Scott was making a couple of minutes ago of having, extremes in both of the parties. The U.S. House is a very representative institution, and so there is an interesting sampling of personality types, egos, backgrounds, and all the rest. And I am by nature a relatively shy person, but you learn quickly that if you're going to get anything done in a legislative body, it's all about relationships, and you can't pick the people that necessarily you want to spend all your time with because they may not be the critical subcommittee chairman that has control over legislation that you care about.
Okay.
So be very intentional about getting to know colleagues and getting to work with people that are very different in style and psychology and background and all the rest. So it's a forced march in accommodating a whole range of personalities, and either you do that or you don't get a whole lot done.
And while we are still awaiting Scott's return, having departed and returned myself, I have faith that will happen. I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the audience that we could bring in when Scott returns, but just to get them tended to. So I had one question, which I've lost now from departing, but it had something to do with when the national media condemn Republicans for holding to the stolen election and being creatures of Trump, does the national media actually escalate the problem? When, I guess, MSNBC, those kinds of operations, if they say this is lamentable that the Republicans are doing that, have they actually added a match to the, I don't know how you could get much of an impact from one match to these flames, but so the
that's
that order.
An interesting question, and not one that I have given any thought to.
Right.
In a vain attempt at self-deprecation, I'll say as a politician, I'm used to answering questions that I haven't given much thought to, but I'll try to do better with this. I don't know whether that's a self-reinforcing vicious cycle between
Right.
behaviors that are then reported on, and the reporting encourages the behavior, and so on. I would suppose, and I think you should probably ask Scott. I hope he's stayed in touch with some of his former colleagues that are still serving on the Republican side. My sense is that most of this has more to do with fear of primary retribution in the Republican Party these days than the dynamic that the questioner is suggesting.
Mhm. Right. And then there was a question, and having had the opportunity to discuss this with you in public on another occasion, there was a question about what you think about Rocky Flats. And it was a very open-ended question. I will just say that we did have a very interesting session a few years ago on the 25th anniversary of the Rocky Flats FBI raid, and that was quite memorable. So I know you have many interesting things to say on that, and Scott is going to appear in, I'm sure, in seconds here, but why don't you do the Rocky Flats question?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with a phone call that I had with Tim Wirth the night that I was elected to the House in 1986, assuming the seat that Tim had served in so admirably for the preceding 12 years. And after he said congratulations, and I congratulated him because he'd just been elected to the Senate, and he said, "David, now Rocky Flats is yours." Which was a shorthand between us because I'd been on his staff way back earlier. How much time that place consumed in our lives as members of the House, in the lives of our staff people, especially those in our district offices that were serving constituents directly and dealing with the problems that they had. But after the Rocky Flats FBI raid, not that I needed to be persuaded at that point, that it was simply hugely more problematic than helpful to the country. We had plenty of nuclear weapons. We were on a course then, happily, for arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, and the discovery of the evidence from the FBI raid was sort of the last straw in my mind. And even though that plant was the biggest single employer in the district that I represented, I called for the closure of Rocky Flats with the strong intention, which I tried to carry out in the years that followed, to make sure that we took care of the workers there that had given their careers, working lives in many cases, to national defense. So it was, and then there was the problem of a safe closure and many years and lots of money to rehabilitate the site so that it didn't continue to present a significant safety and environmental risk to the Denver metropolitan area. Still work to be done.
Well, Scott, we're just delighted as always. We've never anything but delighted to see you. But now, after your little brief absence, we're really happy. I've been going through some questions from the audience. And so there was a question on Rocky Flats. And it was really to both of you. And of course, it was David's district. So that was something that he was ready and has spoken on many a time. But what was that for you? The Rocky Flats raid, the FBI raid, where you, as a member of the Colorado delegation, as a citizen, what is the Rocky Flats story to you?
Well, at the time, I didn't have an understanding of it, and you've got so much going on that you have to pick partners that you can rely on, and that's a perfect example of where you could say, "Hey, David, tell me a direction to go on this," because frankly, you didn't have time to ramp up to figure out where the best interests for the state and so on were. So that would have been a very good example where I can't recall exactly, but I would have certainly reached out to Congressman Skaggs and looked to his lead, and frankly, followed that guidance
Yeah.
to the extent that I could.
Well, and that's its own fine testimony on relationships and their importance. I'm going to just tell you that I'm going to get to the question about whether you ever had an occasion where your friendship was tested, and then we are going to get back to some more, but I'm going to get a couple of audience comments in here. And one of them is from Tom Corson, who would like me to read this statement. A statement, if I may. When my late wife, Mary Malarkey, was sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court of Colorado, Congressman Skaggs sent her a telegram congratulating her on your ascension to secular infallibility. We treasured that. Important form of public service, and Justice Malarkey was totally the best. And on another, maybe tonight, I will tell you how she transformed my life by making me a dramatically better public speaker. So another story. And then Tom Corson does have the question for you, Scott. Okay, ready? Here you go. Congressman McInnis, did Congresswoman Boebert consult you before announcing her campaign for the 3rd District?
The answer to that would be yes. That's not uncommon. I think it's a courtesy visit, and I did that when I was first running, that the previous holders of that office would be, at least the folks that were thinking about running would stop by and visit with you. So I probably had in this last congressional cycle 8 or 9 people that stop by and ask if they could have a cup of coffee with me, and then they'd get to the subject. As it turns out, most of them don't run, but they usually do reach out early in the process to kind of the office leaders of the time or the party leaders at the time to either advise us or seek advice. So the answer to that question was yes.
Right. So you must get a little, when people say to you, hey, can we have a cup of coffee? You must think, okay, I know what you're up to here. I know what you're planning here. It must be a moment of thinking.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Well, I wondered if someone
Yes.
that.
What did you tell her?
Oh,
Well, first of all, I told him that I stay neutral in this kind of thing. And Scott Tipton was a longtime friend of mine. And Scott worked with me, and his folks, both now deceased, were great supporters of mine. And I made it clear that I was going to support the incumbent. However, should she succeed in the primary, I would immediately support her. But I'll tell you something with Congresswoman Boebert. I mean, it reminded me a lot of when we were young. You know, you looked out there and there wasn't a mountain you didn't think you could climb, and you thought you could go back to Congress and move that ship overnight. She's full of energy. And, you know, unfortunately, the way human life works is you get lots of energy at the beginning and you don't get the wisdom until you get a little older. It's too bad they both didn't come in. You as you get wiser, you lose the energy. As you lose the energy, you get wiser. And I was there too. So it did kind of have a wow effect on me. The enthusiasm and the drive, while I may not, you know, we didn't have an in-depth discussion on the issues because I said up front where I was in regards to Congressman Tipton. But I was impressed, and I can tell you that I did, after she won the primary, I attended a number of speeches where she spoke, and I was amazed at her speaking ability and the standing ovations that she would get. Now, obviously, these are partisan, you know, it's a campaign season, but people can try and take shots at her, but I'll tell you, she's got a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm, and it did remind me of my earlier days, and I'm sure Congressman Skaggs' days as well.
sort of
You know,
retiring.
you learn a lot. You get back, and it was kind of funny. I'm sure Congressman Skaggs remembers this, but after you became your second or third term in Congress, you could always 100% pick out the new Congress people, the freshman class, because they were all bubbling, and all you guys and gals that were incumbents, you're the old boy network, or you know, it's time for change, and we got to get rid of this and do that, and after a couple of terms, they then would be in that position looking at the freshman class saying, just calm down a little. calm down. It's going to work out.
But I guess I'm kind of
So-
struck by how you're giving us a model here where evolutionary biology may be working against really the most effective congressional service, that the energy and the wisdom are not coinciding in the human life stages. That was kind of an interesting angle here, that we are having those little bit of an
Yeah.
incompatibility there. And maybe it worked better when we were out on the savannah as early humans. So, okay, so I want to go to some of the aspects of our times. Well, first I wanted to say, was there ever a time when your friendship was tested, that you had a disagreement that was intense enough to make you think this could be it for us? Was there ever such an occasion?
Nothing
Well,
I
I'll
recall.
start. The answer for me, no, never. It never happened with David Skaggs. And David and I voted different on a lot of different issues. And there were times where Congressman Skaggs and I couldn't reach a compromise. And, you know, it would like be maybe a wilderness bill. For example, that the perception in Boulder was different than the perception over on the impact on the in my congressional district. Or water rights, you know, 80% of the water is on the west slope, 80% of the population's on the east slope. And so we were not able to reach a compromise, but never did it go to the extent that it tested the friendship or the professional regard I had for Congressman Skaggs. I just don't envision that would happen with, I mean, David was always professional, an excellent listener. So that question's an easy one to answer. The answer is no.
Yeah, I was more cautious than you, Scott. I wish I could say with absolute assurance there was never an occasion in which we got mad at each other, but I don't remember any. And I think if there had been one, I'd remember it. So yeah, I'm with you.
That is.
And I will say it's not that I didn't get mad. Come on, David, vote with us and against your constituency. But there's a big difference between mad or upset and questioning your friendship.
Yeah.
So my response was, and that's what what David intended. Sorry, I'm so used to appropriate. I keep calling him.
I'm gonna start calling you Commissioner McInnis.
That's how you answer. I know. No, call me Congressman. Anyway, no, but that's what he meant too. The friendship was never tested. But sure, we were both our legal background. We were both advocates for our districts, and I think we were both very good at it.
Right, and I guess I am thinking that there was really more congruence than most people would have expected, who are orienting to our times, on environmental issues. That you, Scott, with the Great Sand Dunes and with the Gunnison, you are not this stereotype. Well, you're not stereotyping much of anything, but you're not the stereotype of the conservative Republican who does not see a cause for conservation or preservation. You seem to have led in a number of these initiatives for national parks designation. So was that just a different era of, well, explain to us how come you have really quite a striking track record in the arena of environmental conservation?
Well, and here I think it's more of a matter of interpretation. We, of course, you know, when you look back, whether it's the EPA or a Mike Strang, remember Mike Strang in the 35-acre tracts and things like that, minimum stream flow, those were Republican orientated. I think the perception is that if you're environmental, you're Democrat, and I don't think that holds at all. And my wife's family, for example, up at the ranching, or my own ancestors felt very strongly about the water issues and so on and so forth. But you know, I mean, there were a lot of I don't know. I guess there were a lot of moments where. Well, I'll give you a good example on the Great Sand Dunes. Joe Heffley, the congressman from Colorado Springs, was chairman of the committee that I had to go through. And he made it very clear to me that it was dead on arrival, that the Great Sand Dunes, and I'm quoting from the newspaper, was nothing but a pile of sand. And it was it was a time where I went to the Speaker of the House. I did research, and there was a a remote rule, or a rarely used rule. In fact, I'm not sure how many people were aware, but I certainly wasn't until we did the research, that I could actually, if the speaker would sign off on it, take the bill back from the committee, go over the top of the head of the chairman of the committee, and take it straight to the House floor. And frankly, when Congressman Heffley was on an airplane coming back to Washington, I went to the Speaker of the House, who was a classmate of Joel Heffley's, and the Speaker granted approval. We went to the House and had the vote. Well, went right to the House floor, had the vote, and otherwise the Great Sand Dunes would have never occurred. So it isn't just necessarily party differences. And I can tell you that, unfortunately, I have respect for Congressman Heffley, but I'm not sure we've spoken since.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was very, very difficult. Very difficult. It wasn't.
But
I mean, again, I respect him, and he represented his district well. But look, so the environment can be shared by all, I think, and we all have responsibilities we need to protect. And so I didn't see a lot of difficulty in doing what I thought was necessary to protect those resources.
well, and I just have to say, on behalf of the thousands or millions who've been to the sand dunes, that was a really good thing that you did. That if it was friendship,
No doubt about it.
That's
And,
right,
we
no,
had
no.
to support. I think the rest of the delegation, I'd have to look at the vote. But, it's the same thing with the Animas La Plata or the Black Canyons, and yeah, you know, I mean, yeah.
But I just think that I have fractured not very many friendships, but I have fractured a few friendships, and the public gained nothing from that. So I think this is really something that you did challenge in terms of a friendship, and the public gained so much from that. And I shall try to do better.
I think with it, well, to put that in its proper context, I think with Congressman Heffley, it was probably fractured a professional relationship. I'm not sure that and I'm not saying anything derogatory. I'm not sure that we had a friendship. We were professionals with each other, but that's what was fractured. We didn't really have a friendship, and that's not being derogatory. I thought very highly of the congressman and his wife from a professional point of view.
Right, thank you. But I think so many people have benefited from your actions with those sand dunes. So, and there were many different dimensions to that, to those actions. So I appreciate that very much. So I would like to go into the question of how the conduct of presidents can create a better or worse context and setting for effective governance from Congress and for bipartisan cooperation in that. So to what degree does the president actually set the limits on what members of Congress will be able to undertake and achieve in the way of real governance and real collaboration? And I know that someone is going to make a humorous remark about the relationship between the House and the Senate, probably before we get out of this topic, because that's a pretty funny remark that people make about the Senate. So, but your destination is how the president can set the context and environment atmosphere for collaborations in Congress, or not set that, or set something else entirely. So, well, David, you want to go there?
Yeah. Well, you know, my answer is shaped by my experience with three presidents, Reagan, the senior Bush, and then Clinton. They were the presidents in the White House when I served in the Congress. Last 2 years of the Reagan administration, but notably, and I wish Laura my wife were on the screen with me, because she could tell this wonderful story about how President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan invited all of us newly elected members, both parties, to dinner at the White House in February, I think it would have been, of 1987. So we were still very much newbies. But wasn't that a gracious thing to do? And you know, it is emblematic, symptomatic, so important as a marker of what is happening too little these days, whether it's that kind of graciousness and hospitality between the White House and members of Congress or within the Congress with each other. To repeat myself, and forgive me, the ability to get anything done in that town is all about relationships, which takes, intentionality and time and a willingness to get to know people that you might not otherwise get to know. So that was the start of that relationship. And Reagan was nothing if not congenial. I mean, he had his problems as we were arriving with the Iran-Contra mess, but and that was had a chilling aspect of its own on the Congress, because the investigations were going on and people were picking sides. George H.W. Bush, I think, set the standard of good comity and bipartisan relationships and all the rest. So again, disagreements on some policy issues, but you knew you could work if you had some reason to be able to work with the Bush White House. And the only thing to mention about Clinton was so much of his presidency while I was there ended up being consumed by the impeachment and the affair that preceded it. And that was, again, one of those circumstances that really divided the House in a very unfortunate way.
Scott, do you want to do this?
Sure. I think that probably the master of the presidents and relationships with the House and the Senate, and you say no jokes between the House and the Senate. So David and I don't joke often about the lower house. We speak highly about the House of Representatives, but if you picked up the joke there. But at any rate, Lyndon Johnson, I mean, read the biography on Lyndon Johnson. Boy, he would get those House members on the phone or those senators. And I mean, everything from love fest to threatening them with everything under the sky. I mean, he was a master at relationships and he got a lot of things done. And, it's a tough business. It's designed to be partisanship. It requires a lot of deal making. It requires a lot of tough discussions, and it requires the utilization of leverage. And Lyndon Johnson in our generations was a master at it. Bill Clinton, you could go to President Clinton. I remember one time going in with a couple of my colleagues, we were fit to be tied, and I can't remember exactly what the issue was at the White House in our meeting with the president. But to the person, the 3 or 4 of us in there walked out of that office after a half an hour with President Clinton, and all of us said, "Man, what he did was rotten, but he's such a good guy. He's a good guy. He's a good listener, and he was a master at it." And when you walked in that door, I mean, he put, now today maybe it's not politically correct, but back then he put his hand on your shoulder, or I mean. He was a master. He could immediately, in my opinion, Clinton could his people skills was amazing, and he could put you in a comfort zone immediately, even though you were furious with him. And that I thought was real strong. Today, the challenges we face is, I think, the protocol and the ethics of language. In the early days of Congressman Skaggs and I mean, David and I, the F word, you never heard publicly. I mean, I'm sure behind the scenes and stuff like that, but I tell you, if a House member would have called the president an MF, or a recent president had called another recent president an MF in public documents, regardless of the party affiliation, that would be deeply offensive, not only to our colleagues, but to the nation as a whole. Today, it's just standard conduct. And I'm not just talking about the F word. I'm just talking about, it just seems that the respect for the position, for example, when Clinton was under his impeachment threats, whenever he came to our meetings and our conferences, the best of my recollection, we may have had one or two members, but out of respect for the position, we stood. And I remember ever yelling, hearing of an incident where people were threatened, chased out of restaurants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So somehow we got to get grasp back on for the protection of the institution, because it is important that a president who plays, obviously, we're a board of directors, or when we served 535, but he was the chairman of the board, or she would be the chairman of the board, and they had the veto pen. So the system was designed that at some point you all have to agree on something, or at least a majority. The presidency plays a very important role with the relationships, and I think it degraded significantly across the board. And you can blame late night shows, you can blame the popular. I mean, there's lots of blame going around, but it's very dangerous for the country, because you ask the question, effectiveness and the importance of the presidency relations with the legislative process is critical.
And I actually am fine and about having the story about the House's view of the Senate. And David, since you were the one who told me that most recently, would you recount that telling anecdote?
Oh, well, or I should defer to Scott since he brought up Lyndon Johnson, but you're talking about the Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson story, which has such currency, it has to be true. So the setting is Johnson, the lanky new freshman congressman from Texas, is on the floor early in his tenure and is really going after a Republican colleague over some bill or other, and comes right up to the edge of violating the very strict protocols Scott was mentioning earlier about how you address colleagues and what language is appropriate and all of that. And so the story goes, Lyndon got a call from Sam Rayburn, then Speaker of the House, also from Texas, tall, lanky Lyndon, short, squat Sam Rayburn. And Rayburn is said to have suggested that Lyndon come down to what was called the Board of Education room in the first floor of the Capitol, where there was a cabinet with some liquid refreshment. And so Rayburn and Johnson were having a drink, and Rayburn supposedly put his hand way up onto Johnson's shoulder and said, "Now, Lyndon, you were a little harsh on our Republican colleagues this morning. You have to remember that they're just our adversaries from time to time. The enemy is the Senate." So that's the story. Can't tell you how many times I heard that.
I think that's pretty good.
I'd like to add on that,
Yeah.
if I can, real quickly. I mean, I've got it right here in front of me. And in 1953, when the Democrats lost control of the House, Democrat leader Sam Rayburn told his caucus not to frustrate the new majority or obstruct the chamber. And we quote, "We're in the minority now. We're still going to be helpful and constructive. Remember, any jackass can kick over a barn door. It takes a carpenter to build one."
Woo.
So, the leadership of the Johnsons, the Reagans, the Rayburns, it's important the work.
Very good. We're getting a tiny twinge of anxiety. We only have 5 or 6 minutes left, but you seem to be on your way to freezing from time to time, Scott. So if you can, if you need to, I suppose you could stop the video, which would leave us hearing your voice. So that's one option, is to try that. The other is just to have us all pray for your internet connection. That would be another thing we can do there. But we want to make sure that we don't lose you for these last few minutes. I think you're in pretty good order right now. So, but just to anticipate that. So just a couple more questions, and I am going to go straight to this hard one of how did you hear about the Capitol takeover on January 6th? How did the news of the takeover reach you? And what was your reaction? and have you had an occasion to reflect well, this might be it, in a bipartisan way about that event on January 6th. So that's a tough one. And then we're going to go out on a more upbeat note here. But what would you say? First, just tell us what you were doing and how you heard about what was happening on January 6th at the Capitol, and how your reactions have began and how they might have changed or stayed the same.
Well, I'll start if that's okay, Scott.
Yes.
Something little known, but a cherished privilege that Scott and I both enjoy as former members of the House is floor privileges. So even today, I can go into the House chamber when I'm back in DC. But I chose to do that shortly after in January of 2001, to listen to and watch the counting of the Electoral College votes that elected George W. Bush. And the irony then was that the presiding officer for that session was Al Gore, who had lost the election to Bush, but soldiered on through the parliamentary formalities. So I just had an interest in watching. So I think I tuned in to that joint session of Congress on January 6th, just sort of for old time's sake. So that's how I first learned that things were falling apart.
Scott, you want to do where you were and how you heard?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I don't remember exactly where I was. I do know when I first heard it, I thought it was probably an exaggerated report. It was not an exaggerated report. But I'll tell you, I guess I went to more of dismay, kind of a general feeling of dismay about what was going on around the country. I mean, I have as David and I both share, as do our colleagues, where we first started in the state capitol. I couldn't believe what was happening at our state capitol when that occurred, the destruction that occurred at our state, and it just seemed to me that the enforcement, the protection of the Capitol stood idle and let this happen. I couldn't believe what was happening across the country, and this just seemed to be the accumulation of all of this coming together at one time over a season of or over a period of several months. I was very discouraged by all of this. I think the country has some serious challenges ahead of it, and I think that there are a lot of things I think we can trace it back to, but I think lack of respectability of the institutions and how special and how critical they are for the future of this country. And again, whether it's late night talk shows, whether it's the way congressional people handle themselves on the floor, whether it's the use of language, whether it's even the dress codes, clear down to the dress codes when you go onto the House floor. I think all of that, we need to dial back to that, and we need to get control of this, because these kind of things should not be happening. And they are happening, much to the delight of our enemies around the world. So we've got to take a strong look internally. I was very appalled by the whole situation.
Well, you asked about reaction as well as how we first learned, and I cried, as I have several times in the last few years, about what's happened to my country.
Right. I have always cried easily, and the opportunities for it don't seem to be letting up. We do have just a couple more seconds, and it's really just anything that you haven't said that you would really like to have. And this is recorded, and people will be looking at it for time to come. So the last question was, do you see prospects for less contentious times on the horizon? So that should not be a yes or no answer, really. So if you would like to take just a couple of seconds on that, do you see prospects for less contentious times on the horizon?
Well, so heaven knows the country has lots of problems, but I still have huge optimism about our future, and the current trend line simply can't be allowed to continue. I wish I had some brilliant remark about how it's going to get turned around, but it will, because we have too much going for us to let the role of America and our politics disintegrate any further.
Make a person cry. There, Scott.
And Dave says it very well. I mean, there's lots of reason for optimism. I mean, you just imagine being in the era of the Civil War or the Black Death, or, you know, how all felt on 9/11. I mean, but time is getting shorter and shorter as far as the advantage outside entities will take. I mean, the capabilities of China and Russia from a military perspective, the emergence of Iran as becoming a superpower, which I think could happen in a coalition with China and Russia, they will take advantage of our negligence. So we've got to get our act together. I'm generally an optimist, but I think what David has said, look, keep your chin up. We've gone through a lot of challenges. In my opinion, not in this same, with the threats we have outside, but the internal threats we've had, we've been in worse situations like the Civil War. And when people say this is the worst thing since they go way back, I'm saying, man, oh man, you have no idea how tough it was during the Depression, and Roosevelt put people to work, and you have no idea the Civil War, brother fighting against brother. I mean, it's bad, but look, we can get through it. We just got to get people like, frankly, David Skaggs and other leaders on both sides of the aisle to continue. I just wish it was a pill we could take and give it to people and say it's the Skaggs pill. It'll work, and it's there. But there's been an immunity.
Your credibility
built
is suffering, Scott.
No, it's not. There's an immunity that's built to the I'm afraid, and I consequence. It'll be okay. I'm an honest.
Well, I think that given how remarkably the bioscientists have performed in getting those vaccines up and out in the world, I don't see why this Skaggs people is really beyond imagination. Those guys are great. They really go into their labs and all kinds of things happen. So the inoculation maybe, well, we're going to take a pill. We're not going to take a shot. I got that, Scott. So Congressman McInnis, Congressman Skaggs, thank you so much for who you are and who you are with each other and who you are in relationship to our nation. So thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Scott. It's great to be with you.